Hey guys, Mr. V over here, doing a book review today for The Coming of the Third Reich by Richard J. Evans. Now, this is a nonfiction book, which is part of a trilogy. It's the first part of the trilogy. This is about the rise of the Nazis in Germany in the 1920s until the early 30s. It stops at 1933, which is when Hitler and the Nazis had taken over the government at that point. So I'm reading this book right after a book called A World Undone, and that book was about World War One. So I had some of the knowledge going into it, just about what happened in World War One, and I would suggest that before reading this book, you do have a little knowledge about it. I don't think you need to read a full book, but you want to have a little knowledge because while the author briefly describes what happens in World War One, I don't think he goes as far in depth as he should for that aspect, because I think that really helps having some knowledge. Another thing that was interesting about this book was the author states in the very beginning, he states in the introduction actually, is that the author feels that it's arrogant to judge history because he said a lot of people don't know how they would react in the time period, and that it's easy for us to say what we would have done looking back at history. But at the time, a lot of us don't know what we would have done, and I think he's talking about for like the everyday German citizens that he doesn't want to judge them too harshly because it's easy for us to say knowing what happened later, and that's why he writes in a non-judgmental way. He states that he's trying to write in a non-judgmental way. And I think that really helps. That way you're just kind of given the facts and you're not given like this tone of someone just continually beating up on something and you again are just presented the facts in that time frame. So I think that really helps. Now I read this book because, as I said, I read a book on World War One, and I just find Germany to be a very interesting study because after World War One, that caused a lot of death and a lot of chaos, and it just cost a lot of money. And then the Germans got hit very badly after World War One, and hyperinflation happened, and the economy just completely collapsed. And he goes in depth about that. How it just completely collapsed. But I find Germany interesting because they were able to rebuild and basically become a global threat within 15 to 20 years. So I was wondering, I was wanting to know, how did they do that? Why did they do that? Which obviously is for anger, but also why did they do it fully to that level? But the other aspect is how did an advanced civilization such as Germany go into such craziness? Not just rebuild, but they went into such craziness. And I was always wondering why, what happened? And this book really describes a lot of that. And he just goes through it in a well-written fashion so you can learn about that. Because he shows how the Nazis became powerful. Again, he goes until 1933, which is right when Hitler took over. And he shows the rise of the Nazis very well. And he covers everything in detail, basically from the start of when they started to become a little bigger, when they started the Nazi Party in general. And it was interesting when reading this book is that they didn't come to power immediately after World War One. I actually thought that they became powerful pretty quickly, but it wasn't actually until the early 1930s that the Nazis became power. And it was actually not easy for them to come to power because I always envisioned them, a lot of people always envisioned them when they were already the big party, when Hitler was already the leader. But at one point, we forget that Hitler was a nobody. He was an absolute nobody. He didn't come from anyone powerful. He was a complete nobody. And in the 1920s, the Nazis actually had very few members. And they were actually just a small group of thugs who were beating people up. They were just an extremist group. And we forget that sometimes because we envision them by the time they got to the 1930s, late 30s or early 40s when they were at war. And an interesting thing when you're reading this book is that even in 1932, when Hitler was running for president of Germany, he only got 37% of the vote. And in 1933, the Nazi Party as a whole only had a 44% vote. They didn't even ever have more than half of the support of Germany. They never had more than half. And that was very interesting to find out. And he shows why. Because people didn't want someone that extreme as the Nazis, but there was also a lot of other groups trying to take over and trying to get those votes. Because there was the Weimar Republic who was in control of the government at the time, but there was also the communists who were trying to take over, and there was also a party called the Social Democrats who were also trying to take over. And all of them were going for power, and they all had a few votes, and that's why they never got more than half vote, and I was always really surprised. But what was really cool was this book covers all the groups. They don't just show the Nazis. Of course, that is the main part of the Third Reich. I mean, he covers that, but he covers the other groups too because they were all vying for power. And he describes the takeover because it was a crazy takeover. The reason I find it crazy was because unlike other times people have taken over the government, it was not an overthrow. They did not overthrow the government. They did not overthrow the president at the time. Yet, after Hitler was appointed to a specific area, the Nazis took over the government within 6 months. And it was just insane when you were reading it, and how they took over every part of Germany. They took over the government, they took over offices, they took over the arts, they took over schools. Everything had to become like the Nazi. And he shows how the Nazis did it. And it's kind of crazy, because you wonder, like, how did you guys go from like 44% people like approving you to like taking over within 6 months? And you wonder, when you're reading the book, where did that other 56% go? He even states in the book, where did they go? And they all caved in. And it's scary when you're reading it, because it's also scary not only reading the rise of the Nazis and how they took over, but it's also scary reading about the rise of anti-Semitism. And that's just very scary as well, because he shows some of the diary entries and things like that about how they fought for Germany in World War I. Yet, just a few years later, the Holocaust would happen, and you just see, it's just tough reading it, and it's just a very sad read for that aspect. Now, there were a few things I did not like about the book. One of the things was that, as I said earlier, I think he went over World War I too quickly, because that was a big factor for the German anger. I mean, the Germans were so angry about World War I, and that is why I think it helps have a little more background than what he gave. I don't think you need to go super in depth, but a little more would help. And you can see how much Germany lost from World War I, and I think it helps having that knowledge. Another part of the book that was a little bit tough was some parts were a bit dry. He mixed in a lot of interesting pages in between, but sometimes the writing came across just a little dry, and sometimes a little like a textbook at times. And he was sometimes just like stating the facts and how they got to points. So sometimes it was not too interesting, or it was a little random. But I think it's important to learn all those facts he wrote in there, and but I think his writing could have been a little different to maybe draw you in a little more. But it was still pretty good in that aspect. And another thing was, it's not quite a negative, but it was just a little tough, and it's nothing to do with the author, is that there's a lot of names and positions when he's talking about the rise of the Third Reich, because there are so many people that would switch positions, and they switched often, and it was confusing at times, like who was the chancellor and who was all these different parts. And it's not the author's fault, but it would have helped out like some kind of reference guide. So that was a little difficult, but that's just something, be prepared if you're going to read this book. But I would definitely, I thought this was still a good overall book, and I would recommend it for people who are interested in like World War I to World War II, because this was a great book to read after World War I and before. I'm going to get into World War II a few books from now, because it's important to know the rise of Germany because of how powerful the Nazis became and basically started World War II type of thing. So it's important to know that information, like the in between, the gap. So I would definitely recommend it. And I'm interested, this is a part of a trilogy. This is about the rise of the Nazis, and the next book will be about living in Germany under the Nazis, which I'm very interested to read, because, like, I was wondering, did the people truly support the Nazis, or was it just purely out of fear? Because as I said earlier, the book talks about how they never got more than half the vote. I thought people really supported them in Germany, but when I find out they didn't get more than half the vote, I'm like, were you guys just living in fear? Were a lot of you living in fear? So that's why I am curious to read his next part, which will cover from 33 to 39. But if you guys have any comments or questions, please post it in the comment section below, because I love hearing your comments. If you guys enjoyed the video today, hit the subscribe button, as I always upload multiple different book reviews. But thank you for watching my book review today. This is Mr. V. Go enjoy reading.